Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Part Spin. I'm Lou.
And I'm Ben.
Today we're going to talk about the top 10 things you got to do to prep your car for your first track day.
And I'm finally wearing a JRP shirt. These guys yelled at me long enough, so now you can look at my nipples.
I'm too, I guess.
Yeah.
So, weather's getting warm. Track season's almost upon us, friends.
The Big Dig. Toronto and the GTA hit with a massive snowstorm, paralyzing roads and stopping traffic in its tracks.
Ben made a snazzy little list for everybody to get your machine ready for track day. So let's start it off, Ben. What's your number one thing to do?
Yeah, so we get calls every day. People just new car or wanting to get into the track.
Mm-hmm.
And so always lots of questions. And we figured we'd do this just to help give people an idea of what are the top 10 things.
Right.
This isn't necessarily the Bible, but just things we would choose to get your car ready for the track. So the first basically comes down to tires. Most cars come with half-decent tires, but it depends on what you're starting with. If you're starting with a Porsche, you can go to the track with stock tires.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, most cars you can go to the track, you're just not going to be putting great times down with a stock tire. If you have an all-season tire or anything like that, definitely a summer tire is going to have better grip. And then also the life of the tire, it's not going to chunk and it's not going to get overheated too easily if you go with something that's a little more performance-oriented.
Right. So it's like an entry-level track guy. What's like a good tire that you can get into that you can still drive your car to the track and drive it home, but also still have a lot of fun out there?
Yeah, a good tire that is good for both track and street would be something like a Michelin Pilot Sport 4S.
Cool.
It's about a 300 tread wear. Really good in the rain. A lot of people actually use them as a wet tire as well. But they're quiet on the street. They're great in the rain. They have pretty decent grip as well. Very progressive breakaway, which is nice. Then if you go up to, say, like a Yokohama Advan Apex, that's a great new tire as well. A little bit more grip, definitely, than the Michelin.
Right.
So there will always be a little bit of a sacrifice as far as rain performance, but still surprisingly good.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of different tires out there, so we're not beholden to one brand or another. But definitely there are some really good tires out there. But typically anything 200 tread wear and above, for the most part, is going to be definitely a do-it-all tire.
Other than tires, you also need some brakes to stop your machine. Whoa, slow down, everybody. Time to talk about some brakes. So, Ben, what do you suggest for the first-time track warrior out there? What setup's best?
Yeah, very much like the tires. There's a couple of different ways you can go about it. There's brakes that do a bit of everything. So the StopTech Sport, the Hawk HPS 5.0 pads, they're both very streetable pads, going to be quiet on the street, a little more dust than your regular pad, but they will take the abuse of track duty.
A little bit noisy too, eh?
These ones won't be too noisy, if any noise at all. Whereas if you go to these, which are basically your straight track brakes, then they will have a little bit of noise, a lot of dust.
Right.
Not to say you can't street them. It's just you're going to sound like a TTC bus coming to a stop every time you come to a stop downtown. So whether that's something that people want to deal with, that's kind of up to you. The next upgrade is something like this, the BBK. But basically this is your next iteration of upgrading your brakes. So most people will do with stock calipers an upgraded pad and then a slotted or even just a better quality standard rotor. Whereas when you go with a big brake kit, you're going with a much bigger rotor. Most of the time they're going to be a 2-piece rotor with a floating center hat and then a 4 or 6 piston big caliper there. So these are going to take a lot more heat, a lot more abuse, and it's just going to sustain it a lot longer.
So do I have to flush my brake fluid every time I go to the track, or what's the deal with brake fluid?
Brake fluid it depends on the fluid that you use. Your stock fluid, typically you want to do every couple of years. The Achilles heel of any brake fluid, even OEM fluid, is moisture. So an OEM brake fluid can take a bit of moisture and they'll go a couple of years. But once you go to the track, you'll hear a lot of people talk about boiling their brakes. And that's basically too much moisture has got into the brakes, or the temperature rating of the brakes has been exceeded. So basically you'll actually boil the fluid in the calipers and in the system itself. And ultimately what that causes is bubbles inside of the system, which when you go to push on your pedal, it actually becomes squishy and you have no brakes. So if you go with something like a 600 fluid, so Motul RBF 600, StopTech STR 600, they're going to have a 600-degree dry boiling point and then a wet boiling point. Wet boiling point is when a little bit of moisture does get into the system, what the boiling point is going to be.
Gotcha. Okay.
So a 600 will have a higher wet boiling point than a 660 fluid. So a 660 fluid you want to do after every track day, every other track day, and is not very street friendly.
Right.
Whereas a 600 fluid, you can do it once a year and still be good.
Okay. All right. Be sure to bleed your brakes too, kids, before your first track day. I made this mistake once. So do it proper. Get a friend. Don't do the 2x4 method. Just, get a friend.
Yeah. Any bubbles in your system is essentially going to mean your brake going to the floor.
Yeah.
And everyone has a pucker moment on the track their first time, and it's just best to have all your cases covered before, or all your corners covered before.
Yeah. The last thing you want is it going spongy on you like 4 laps in.
Yeah.
All right. So what we
had to pull a Chris James.
Yeah. Chris James. Oh no, I wasn't there. Cut the Chris James on the track.
Next up's alignment.
Yep. The next thing you need to do for your machine before you take it to the track is get a proper alignment. Not only does this make sure you wear your tires properly, it'll also make sure all your suspension geometry is straight and make sure you have the best experience on the track. So what do we got here, Ben? What do we need?
Yeah, alignment, like you mentioned, a lot of cars actually have alignment ability from the factory. So you'll have either eccentric bolts or some sort of adjustable camber arms. But especially for tire life, camber and toe and everything is very important. You'll actually see quite a significant upgrade as far as your handling ability and possibly even your track times just by doing a simple alignment. But these are for cars who basically don't have any adjustment. So you can do something like this, which is an eccentric bolt. So just by turning the bolt, that gives you some positive and negative camber adjustability. And then if your car doesn't have the ability to use those, you replace it with an arm, something like that, which has the adjustment built into it.
Oh, that's a nice piece. What are some pointers for your first track day alignment? I know you don't want to be going all sorts of -2 everywhere.
No.
But I'm sure you don't want to go with a full 0 setup too.
No.
So what's like a nice happy medium? Maybe say for a front wheel drive, a rear wheel drive, and then an all wheel drive. So.
Yeah. Typically front wheel drive, they'll take as much camber as they can get, especially if they're heavy. Lighter cars that don't need necessarily as much, but a happy medium as far as a street setup in camber is usually between 1.5 negative and -2 degrees. Tram lining won't be too bad, but it will help with the dartiness or the turn in of the car. If it's a rear wheel drive car, you'll want a little less camber in the rear to help with grip and stability, but a little more camber in the front to help with turn in. And then front wheel drive cars, typically maybe a little bit less in the front, but like I mentioned, front wheel drive, you do usually want a little bit of camber in the front. The full track guys usually are 2.5 degrees plus, just because the more the weight's throwing around, you can use more of your tire, and the camber really helps even out the wear of the tire. So the shoulders of your tire aren't going to be taking the brunt of the abuse.
No, that's for the full track setup, boys. I mean, if you're just rolling on the streets, one's enough. Honestly, you don't got to go all Chris James on us with like
-5,
-26 or some stuff. Cut the Chris James' car right now.
Next, let's talk about wetting your water.
Oh yeah, cooling. So the next thing you're probably gonna need to look at is cooling mods for your car. The last thing you want is you're like an hour into your track day and your car starts overheating.
Look at this. What's this thing?
Overheating.
Ah! Hashtag Subaru life.
And you're bummed. So, Ben, what do we need to keep cool on that first track day?
Yeah, in Ontario, unfortunately, where we are, Southern Ontario, we get super muggy. Well, compared to some of the Southern U.S., probably not so much, but hey, we're Canadian.
Worst case, Ontario.
Yeah, it's super muggy here in the high 30s to low 40 degrees Celsius. So it gets hot, and a lot of cars just can't cope with that. So either upgrading to something like a higher efficiency, higher capacity, rad is definitely going to help a lot, or even just something as simple as water wetter. Comes in diesel and gas formulations, and essentially it just makes sure that little bubbles don't form along the edges of the inside of your coolant ducts, and just stops or helps reduce anyways the amount of hot spots. So this can help bring a couple degrees down. This is going to bring a lot more than that.
Yeah, cool. And don't forget to properly bleed your coolant too before your first track day.
Yeah, not as bad as your brakes, but still not good for the engine.
Yeah, not good for your motor. And I mean, when your car's overheating too, and you crank that heater and it's not getting hot, you know you're bummed. So bleed your coolant, everybody.
Next up, we're getting your oil and fluids.
Oil.
We're back.
All right, so next up for your machine is definitely a service with some fresh oil before your first track day. You don't want to go there with 3,000 kilometers since your last oil change and it's looking pretty dark and you're still questioning if you should go. So it's always best to do a fresh service. What do you recommend, Ben? What's a good, what are the top tips oil-wise for your first track day?
Essentially, oil is the lifeblood of your engine. You always want to make sure that you have good oil as well as oil that's not at the end of its life before you go and take it to the track. The track's a unique place where you're putting a lot of heat into all the fluids and it ultimately breaks down the fluids a lot quicker than just daily driving would. So we always recommend, if you're going to track the car, do all of your fluids, your diff, your trans, your engine. Obviously, you should do more, but do them at least once a year, including your brake fluid. Just that way, you're guaranteeing that everything's gonna hold up to the stress test. As far as engine oil is concerned, there's a wide variation of product out there. So if it's something that's a non-synthetic, you should probably do it after every track day. If you're doing something that's a semi-synthetic, maybe 1 or 2 track days. If you're doing something high-end that's a full synthetic, an ester-based, like these red lines, then you can push it a little bit more. But ultimately, it's just better to be safe than sorry. Yeah, do it after every track day or every other.
Yeah, especially after like a multi-hour session, you're going to want to do an oil change.
Yeah, you'll see oil temperatures as well as water temperatures getting fairly hot at the track. Anything over 230, 240 Fahrenheit is starting to get pretty hot. So these fluids can take that, not much more. Regular synthetic or a non-synthetic wouldn't take that by any means. It would definitely start to fall apart by then, and ultimately your bearings and the rest of your engine's life is compromised at that point. So always keep an eye on that stuff, and it never hurts to bring an extra quart or two, as well as just a rag or something to check your oil between sessions, just because as the car warms up and cools down, you'll be surprised how much your oil level actually moves.
True.
Next up, we're going to sway bars.
Sway bar. So along with your alignment earlier that we discussed, another thing you'd like to do for your suspension setup for your car is a nice sway bar setup for your front and rear. Now, depending on if you have an all-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, or rear-wheel drive setup, your setups are going to be a little bit different. Ben, so we want to talk a little bit about what setups we should be running for a front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, and all-wheel drive setup. For me personally, on my Shitbox Honda EK, I'm running a 22 in the front and nothing in the back, just because when I run one in the back, it gets hella slippy. So I just let it keep the back roll loosey-goosey for maximum grip. But what would you do in your Camaro for rear-wheel drive?
For the Camaro, basically not any, but depends on the car. There's so many different variations for cars. Sway bars are interesting just because they actually work the opposite. So if you want better front end grip, do a rear sway bar. If you want better rear end grip, do a front sway bar. So doing a front sway bar makes the car push a little bit more through corners, makes it understeer a little more. But on cars like the new Supra, the A90 Supras, they're actually quite twitchy in the rear end, so that neutralizes that. And then cars that are very rear happy put a stiffer sway bar, and that kind of subdues that a little bit. Typically in front wheel drive, don't even touch the front sway bar. Obviously, depending on the car, some are worse than others, but everyone always puts a stiffer sway bar in the rear. That helps the front grip up, turn in, as well as the rear come around. Most of them are going to be adjustable, so you can kind of play with that, adjust the stiffness on the go. But that's typically what people will want to do. But a sway bar is a great upgrade. It doesn't really affect the car too much in your day-to-day driving, but it definitely does affect it when you go to the track. And it's a simple, cheap, typically simple bolt-on. So it's not like you need an engineering degree to put on, but on certain cars like my Focus ST, it'd take as much sway bar as you could throw at it in the rear, just because the rear needed that, or the front needed that much extra grip.
Gotcha. How about for like an all-wheel drive setup?
All-wheel drive, especially on Subarus, Audis as well, where the motor is actually in front of the front axle. Rear sway bar definitely helps a lot. Helps with front end grip, reduces the push a little bit, and then also helps the rear end rotate a little bit better in corners. You can do a front sway bar as well as a rear to help fine tune everything, but typically that's what we see people do.
Awesome. And also, when you're upgrading your sway bar, everybody, don't forget to upgrade your end links. The stock, depending if you're lowering or raising your machine, your stock sway bar links will not do. Yeah. You got to get something adjustable so that then you can fine tune it a little bit better.
Other than the adjustments that the sway bar already comes with, being 2 bolt holes or 3 bolt holes, you can actually adjust preload as well, which again stiffens it more or reduces stiffness.
And most aftermarket sway bars will actually give you 2 or 3 settings for where you can put these bad boys, so you can really dial in that feel for you.
Yeah. Adjustment's key, especially for the track. It suits different driving styles because the car that I set up versus the car that he sets up may be completely different, even though everything's exactly the same. So if you're driving like a ham fist or if you're a very controlled and very smooth driver, you're going to set the car up completely different.
Absolutely. Next up, we got fire extinguishers. Fire extinguishers.
Have you been on fire and you never want it to happen again? Sometimes when your car's on fire, it's honestly just best to let it go and to not deal with a half-burnt car and having to rebuild it. But if it's just a small little fire, basically we've got these to handle that. You start off with something like the Element fire extinguisher. They come in 2 different sizes, I guess you could call them. There's a 50-second and there's a 100-second. A typical 5-pound bottle only has about 11 seconds worth of extinguisher in them. So these actually have quite a bit in them, especially for how small they are. You can throw it in your center console, mount it anywhere. It's pretty handy and relatively inexpensive as well. But it's always just nice to be safe. Better to be safe than sorry. Obviously, with fire, shit gets real quick. So you just got to be careful. When you want to upgrade, if you're doing some sort of racing series, endurance racing, anything like that, that's when you get to suppression systems. Definitely a lot different from that. So a suppression system from Sparco typically has about 6 nozzles, 1 for the engine, 1 or 2 for the engine bay, some for the passenger compartment, and then for either the fuel cell or the rear of the car. These are set off by either an external plug or something on the outside of the car, as well as some are inside the car. It'd be a button or a little thing that you pull on that sets the extinguisher off, and it basically coats the entire car to kind of snuff anything out. But these typically are a lot more expensive, a lot more invasive as far as the installation is concerned, just because it doesn't really make sense to have an interior if you're going to have something like this. So definitely something like that if you're just a weekend warrior. There's 2 different types of extinguishers. There's like a powder chalky type, which can be corrosive. So anything it gets on, it's going to etch. And then there's also a clear type, which isn't corrosive. It's a little bit better, but I'm not sure what these are, to be honest.
Comment down below if you want to see us test these things, because you guys know we want to see them work too.
We're men, we want to burn shit.
Yeah. A lot of events and a lot of track days, having a fire extinguisher is actually mandatory. So especially for drift events, you got to have one of these. Once you go to tech and you don't have one, they're like, no bueno. So always have a fire extinguisher. You can mount it in a lot of places. Like I usually put mine right below the passenger seat. I made like a little bracket. Element actually has got some really cool stealth brackets that they sell to mount your roll cage and all that. And it's really come a long ways. Like since back in the day, this was really the only option we'd have, like a giant extinguisher. So
leaves no residue.
Oh,
so this isn't corrosive then?
Yeah, we just read on the back that it leaves no residue.
Reading for the win.
You learn something new every day, kids. Next up, we got race gas. Everybody gasolina. All right, race gas. Here we go. So Ben, this is probably the one topic I don't know too much about because I'm always jerry canning 94 to the track. So let's tell the homies out there what's the deal with race gas, other than obviously you need a tune to run this stuff.
So we'll talk about race gas concentrate, which is what we have right here, and then race gas in general, which most people will think about. So essentially, the better the octane you can put in your car, the better, basically, just because The higher the octane, the less knock. So it's a very good knock preventative. And then if you have a boosted car, it also helps keep temperatures down a little bit and also helps give a little bit more energy to the fuel, which makes more power. So basically, you have a pump or in a big can race gas like a VP or something like that. The issue with those kind of gases is that if you do not use them quickly, they separate very fast, so it actually goes bad. Normal fuel will do that, but typically you have a little bit longer time there. But we always recommend 91 octane minimum when going to the track. Depending on the car, NA cars or like lower power cars don't need phenomenal fuel, but again, like oil, like a lot of things we're talking about, it's just better to be safe than sorry. So when we come to the race gas concentrate, a lot of people mistake it as an octane booster. I guess it kind of is, but octane boosters, the way that they work is they raise the points, but they don't actually raise the energy of the fuel. So it actually makes the car go lean when you're up wide open throttle, which is obviously not good. Like lean is bad. Lean creates heat. Lean creates knock and pre-detonation, a bunch of bad things. So what race gas, and there's a couple other brands out there, to be honest, not many that actually work like this stuff. But essentially, it actually adds energy to the fuel. So it's very much like putting in race gas. But the nice thing is that you can mix this in with your pump fuel. And you're not lugging around jerry cans full of race gas, C16, anything like that stuff. And they actually have a nice little chart on the back, which gives you how much race gas to use to get to your preferred octane setting.
Cool. So what's the difference between the purple stuff and the orange stuff?
So the orange stuff basically goes up to 105 octane. So this is meant for your cars that have catalytic converters, just because the purple stuff, although it does give you a higher octane rating, it can clog up your cats after a while. So definitely if you have a street car or something with cats, use the orange stuff. 105 octanes tons. The purple stuff definitely would be for someone who's making a lot more power, catless, very high boost, even motorcycles, snowmobile, stuff like that. But that gets up to 112 octane.
Gotcha. So I know you mentioned that running race gas will cool your cylinder a little bit more. So I want to talk a little bit about some water meth injection to just get a little bit more cooling in the cylinders.
Yeah. So a higher octane fuel, contrary to belief, burns actually slower, but it burns slower and it burns fuller or more complete. Essentially, higher octane fuel is going to burn slower. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to make more power. Then you get to something like the water meth. So this is 50% or 51% methanol, or no, 51% water, 49% methanol. So methanol essentially is fuel. So just think of it as injecting more fuel into your engine. And this basically gets injected through the intake ports. There are many different water meth systems out there, but this is a great way to add a little bit of extra octane to your fuel, make a little bit more power, but it also, the water helps cool down the charge as well. So it helps bring temps down. The only downside to this stuff is that you have to keep an eye on it. So if you're tuned for it, if you're at the track, you do run through it very quickly. So you can run out, and running out can be bad. So just keep an eye on it. Most water meth systems have actually a low fluid sensor. So it'll actually have a warning when it happens. And then if you have a fail-safe setup, it'll knock it down to wastegate or just something, a more safe level if ultimately you lose line pressure or you run out of fluid.
Oh, cool. So it'll just go into limp mode for you and save your motor. Nice. I don't know if I'm at the water meth yet for my first track day, but if you're thinking about it, you probably need it.
Doesn't hurt. Doesn't hurt.
Yeah.
And you can do it on NA vehicles as well as boosted vehicles. It helps everything, but very different setups. But it can be used on pretty much anything, and it's relatively inexpensive power as well, which is nice.
We got tow hooks next. Tow hooks. Ben, I'm sure just like me, you've gotten towed off the track before. It's kind of one of the things that people don't really think about till they're getting their front bumper ripped apart by the tow truck dude.
It's a rite of passage, to be honest.
That's true. It is.
Are you really tracking unless you're blowing stuff up and getting towed off the track? Essentially, it is mandatory for most tracks, just because if unfortunately you do send it off the track, they just don't want to be liable for damaging your car in any way. So a tow hook's always a really good way. And some people actually prefer them for the looks because they look cool on some cars, especially some of your JDM cars. So it's both functional and there for a good reason. And if you see some of the diesel guys on YouTube, you can pull out transport trucks. We've all been to the track and seen people that haven't. I remember quite fondly seeing a Civic get pulled out of the grass, and the bumper came with it, but the rest of the car did not. Lightweight mods.
Yeah, I know.
Lightweight mods.
But if you're a Civic owner, honestly, the factory hooks are still under there. Just look. Don't let the guy catch your bumper. But with this, there's no guessing. You grab it, you pull. But also, please mount this to a proper cross beam, steel piece, your frame, not to your bumper.
No. Unfortunately, I've seen too many tow hooks or incorrectly mounted, and all that's going to do is just rip more of your car off.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not going to help your cause at all.
Yeah.
So typically, OEM tow hook mount, you'll see mounted to the subframe or a frame rail of some sort.
Yep.
Some you may see underneath the car on like a K member or something like that, or a subframe member, but never tow from control arms, from just bumpers, anything just laying on your bumper.
Yeah. Don't mount this to your rad support because it's going to rip that right out when they pull it.
Or do, because I want to see that.
If you like what you saw, hit us up with a like, a comment, and please subscribe. We appreciate all that stuff. Let us know down below if there's any other things we missed to, make your track day a bit better. We want to make sure everybody has fun out there, guys. We want to make sure you're prepared, because the last thing you want is to show up and you're not prepared.
Yeah.
And you wasted a whole day and you just end up watching everybody, which is still fun, but not as fun as driving.
And ultimately, track days can be expensive. So like Lou said, you don't want to waste the money. But like you said, like, subscribe.
All right, guys. Thanks for checking us out.